Thank you, Joshua.
So we are recording now. Welcome to Dharma Portal. Today I'm having a special guest, Paul Anthony Wallis, and I only heard about you about, I think, 2 or 3 months ago. I started watching some of your YouTube videos, the fifth kind. And by the way, you have an amazing voice for that.
Thank you.
And very interesting information, very interesting information. Not entirely new for me. I already researched this, but you have a very clear, it's so clear when you're presenting it. I really totally enjoy it. And so I bought your books and I read the last one, The Scars of Eden. And it is one of the most well-written books that I've been coming across so far in a long time. So I really would love everybody to read this book. It's putting things in perspective in a really, really good way. So welcome to the show.
Thanks, Joshua. Thanks for having me on the show.
And if we could start with, you could maybe talk a little bit about your story, how you ended up doing what you're doing right now, and your background.
Sure. Well, what I'm doing right now is exploring ancestral narratives, world mythology, for the insights they hold on our origins as a species. And I write in the field of what's generally called paleocontact. And that's the idea that our ancestors had contact with ET visitors or colonizers in the deep past. How I got there seems to surprise a lot of people because my background is in the world of Christian ministry. For 33 years, I worked as a church doctor, an archdeacon in the Anglican Church, and a theological educator. And my focus was training pastors in hermeneutics, which are the principles of handling ancient texts, how to interpret them, what the science of that is. And so through all that 33 years, I was having to engage quite thoroughly with the Bible, the source document of Christianity. And through all that time, I kept coming across anomalies in the stories that we tell from the Bible, things that didn't quite line up, that didn't quite make sense. And like any preacher, or probably like any parent reading a children's Bible to a child, you come across something that doesn't quite make sense, a question you can't answer, and you think, oh, I must get back to that at some point, come up with a better answer. Well, finally, I did have the time to sit down and drill down into some of these questions. And because my first love was languages, at school I learned French, German, Latin, went on to study Portuguese, Italian, Greek. I go to texts and my first question is, what do the words mean? Mm-hmm. And so that's what I did with these anomalous moments in the Bible, drilled down into what do the words mean? What's the etymology of the words? Mm-hmm. And what happens if we make some different translation choices? The moment I asked that question, some particular words took me down a rabbit hole where you make some different translation choices and a totally different explanation of human origins stares you in the face. And it's not a random story. It is a repeat of the Mesopotamian stories on which Genesis is based. So the Sumerian, Babylonian, Akkadian, and Assyrian stories. Mm-hmm. And when you read them side by side, the way they finesse each other is really quite extraordinary. A totally different explanation of who we are, where we came from, and a version of events that repeats in ancestral narratives all around the world. So that was the journey it took me on. And it was that journey that resulted in my book, Escaping from Eden. And then the response from that has led to the sequel, The Scars of Eden.
Interesting. So you've been on a huge inner transformation, you could say, right? You had to kind of burn down some castles and build some new realities out of that, right?
Very much so. And the Scars of Eden is really walking with people as they do the same thing, as they reframe a lot of their old thinking and their old stories and work out how these things go together. If these ancient stories that say we are part of a wider cosmic family, that our evolution was modified by contact with our wider family. If that's the case, then where does that put the beliefs I held before about God and Jesus, myself, the cosmos? There's a lot of reframing that has to happen. And I found that my appreciation of Jesus and my appreciation of God did shift fairly significantly through that process. But it takes a while to think through the implications, to take a building down and then rebuild something slightly different. It takes a while, and that's the process I share in many of the videos on the Fifth Kind TV and in the Scars of Eden as well. But you're right, it's a huge inner journey, but it didn't come from out of nowhere for me. These were questions that had been simmering in the back of my mind for quite a time.
And so when you say your relationship to God and the Christ has shifted, would you say it has become more intimate?
Yes, I would say my appreciation of how intimately we are all connected with each other and with our source has transformed. And it's a different sense of intimacy, because religions can give you a certain feel for that and a certain feel of intimacy, but very often it's based on exclusivities. You know, we're the chosen people, we're the ones who know God, and everyone who disagrees with us, well, they're on the outside. And as I went back to the ancient texts and went back and revisited the teachings of Jesus and the apostles, I realized they're not saying that. They're saying something quite different. The Apostle Paul, when he had to describe what he meant by God to an audience that didn't know any of the ancient Hebrew texts, so he's really having to start from scratch. He says, by God, I mean the source of the cosmos and everything in it, that in which we all live and move and have our being. And what he gives in that answer is very different to the idea of God that a lot of religions run with, because a lot of religions run with the idea that we're all separated from God. And we have to claw our way back through, you know, their particular religion. Religions often have a very anthropomorphic idea of God. He's like a great big king who will reward some and punish others. Well, in that explanation by Paul, there is none of that. We're all intimately connected with the source. Our consciousness all emanates from the same source consciousness. And that more cosmic vision was there right at the beginning of Christianity. And it was there in Plato, nearly half a millennium before Christianity. And as I started reading these ancient texts and realizing there's this other story about our origins, I then had to go back to my notes from theological college and remember that there were significant leaders in the early church who believed the things I put out in Escaping from Eden, who believed in paleo contact. And I had to think, well, how did they square that with their belief in God? And I realized their idea of God was a little bit different. It was this much more cosmic vision, the idea of the universe beginning with a unified field of consciousness and intelligence that then fractalized to form everything in the material universe, yourself and myself included. That was where they were coming from. And they were not coming from this vision of an anthropomorphic, punitive, unforgiving, don't get on the wrong side of him kind of king that then became the idea that institutional Christianity ran with.
Okay, well, so this is the first time I'm speaking to a pastor in many, many decades. So I have a confession to make. I was as a child I'm from Denmark. We go through this process where we are going into adulthood. I don't know what it's called in English. You go in and say you still believe in God, in the church.
Yes,
I think
it's called confirmation.
Confirmation, yes. Okay. So I got into the church and the priest was teaching me, and I kept on interrupting him and telling him that Jesus didn't say that. He said something else. And I started telling him what Jesus said and what he really meant, and et cetera, et cetera. And I kept on going like this. And in the end, the priest kicked me out, and he didn't want to give me confirmation because it was too much for him. And I asked all these questions nonstop. And so since then, I have had in my entire life this love-hate relationship to Christianity, because
Yes.
something for me just didn't feel right. I would say that was a very mild statement, like doesn't feel right
Yes.
is very mildly said. Something in
So,
me get really upset about how
yes.
they have distorted and destroyed and perverted a very original, beautiful white light of pure knowledge and deep spirituality, which is universal, which is for everyone, and nobody can be excluded from this. And so
Yes.
I was an extreme rebellious against this whole thing, and I have I basically most of my life, anytime I heard any Christian words, I just got up and left, like because I don't want to hear it and I'm not interested. Like I just really rejected it, and
Yes.
it hasn't been until in my recent years, because I met some Christians that are mystics, or more, it's juicy, it's alive. The Christ within them is pulsing. The Christ consciousness is allowed to, and it doesn't become dogmatic. It doesn't become,
Yes.
and so when I meet these people, then suddenly I can actually sit still and hear these words being spoken again, the more Christian kind of terminologies, and I don't get this allergic reaction. And
Yes.
so I have been building up this ability to actually be with it. But what I really, really, really loved about your book is that you said very clearly the Christ is one thing, and then these what do you, I don't even know what you call it, but these stories that have been brought in and modified and changed and all these things that has nothing to do with that Christ consciousness. Like that's what I got out
Yes.
of, and that was maybe the biggest thing in the book that I received there, and you wrote it in so beautiful, clear words. And if you could talk a little bit about that, because I think there's a lot of Christians out there who loves Christ and they are attracted to this light and they feel it's right and it is right. And there's something profound and mystical and they have spiritual experiences. So it must be true, right? But maybe we can talk a little bit about what it is we need to just make sure that to point out what is what, and not
Yes.
confuse these two. I think this is huge. This is massive.
Definitely. Oh, thank you so much for sharing your story, Josh. I can relate to it very closely, actually, because those issues that you had when you were, what, 12 or 13, where they threw you out because you were a seeker.
Yes.
You had questions that they couldn't answer, and you had a perception of things that was quite possibly more accurate than you were hearing from the ministers and the priests. And it's so sad and frustrating to me when I hear stories like that. I hear from people every week, some weeks every day, from people who have had an experience like that, where they've been dislocated from their families, from their faith communities, because they asked too many questions, or because they had seen something or experienced something that just didn't fit with what the organization wanted to teach. Now, I first had an experience like that when I was 5 or 6 years old. So a little bit younger than you were when you were thrown out. And I went to a Church of England school. And in that school in the UK, where I grew up, you would be taught the mainstream scientific answers to questions, and you'd be taught the traditional Orthodox Christian answers. And that was all very well and fine, until one morning when the school principal, Mrs. May, said to us all in a school assembly, she said, now Mrs. Clark's class are going to come in and teach us a new hymn. And so Mrs. Clark was the one teacher who could play the piano. So her class came in they started singing this hymn that began with the words, "When Jesus was a little boy." And the hymn went on to say, when Jesus was a little boy, he was perfect. He was perfectly well behaved. He was always polite to his parents, did everything he was asked, super obedient. He was obedient to his teachers, model student. And kids, that's how you should be too.
Mm.
And I listened to that hymn, and even at that tender age, and I know I was no older than 6, I sat there thinking, this is ridiculous. Do they think we can't see through this? They're just trying to get us to toe the line. And I was very angry about it because I thought it was mean and dishonest. And I thought it probably had nothing to do with Jesus. This was just the school trying to take power over the kids. So it's funny, you know, in a 6-year-old way, I was getting a picture of how institutions distort spirituality.
So I don't understand.
Institutional.
How could you then study to become a priest if you had this experience?
Well, the story's longer.
Okay.
So I'll tell you what happened next.
Yeah.
I went home and I spoke to my dad and I said, Dad, it really annoys me when the teachers talk like that. And my dad was, you know, reading the newspaper, having one of these half-conscious conversations with his kid that all of us parents do. And I said, I mean, they talk about God as if they know what they're talking about, but they haven't met God. For all they know, their God is a giant green dragon. And my dad said, yes, you're probably right. Well, what's really interesting looking back on that 6-year-old conversation is firstly, that I was alert enough to spot there's a difference between Jesus and the institution that's trying to manipulate his name or his memory. And then what I said about, for all they know, he could be a giant green dragon. Decades later, I realized that the Bible is in fact full of stories of dragons. That's to say, entities that are not human. They sound like dragons. They breathe smoke and fire. They consume prodigious volumes of cattle, sheep, virgin girls, and they govern over human colonies.
Yeah.
And then they send their humans to war against each other because they're in competition for resources and for hegemony. Those stories are all in the Bible. And what I discovered as I did my research for Escaping from Eden is that those stories have been whitewashed over by translating the name of those entities as God. Mm-hmm. But the root meaning of those words is the powerful ones. Mm-hmm. And you reread those stories with the word Elohim, meaning powerful ones. That's what it means. It's plural masculine form, with plural verb forms. That's when the stories flip and you realize you're looking at paleo contact. Mm. But the midpoint, to answer your question, Joshua, about my journey, is that suspicion of institutional Christianity really led me into atheism for a long time. And then I encountered Eric von Daniken when I was 11 years old. And I latched onto him because I felt this was a more thoughtful, intelligent response. Mm-hmm. I found the Christian answers I was getting at school really lazy. Who are we? Where did we come from? Oh, God made us. Yeah. And a story. But I thought, well, that doesn't explain why we're so obviously animals. If we're a unique creation by God, why is it clear we're some kind of a primate or some kind of an ape? Couldn't explain it. And then if I went to the mainstream scientific answer, how come we're the alpha species on planet Earth? Well, only because of our technology, our higher intelligence. Without that, if you or I were left out in the jungle to fend for ourselves, you know, within 3 nights, we'd probably be dead, ill, or hopefully hospitalized. How come all the other animals on Earth are supremely adjusted to living on the planet and we're not, without being able to make fire, without being able to build a shelter, without forming a weapon? We're useless. And so the question of where did our intelligence come from? Where's the explanation? Eric von Daniken put his finger on that problem. the gap in our ability to explain ourselves. And he proposed that if we allow for the possibility of interventions in our evolution, then we might be able to explain how we got from there to here. And it was that chain of thought that actually took me into Christianity and then has taken me into my field of study today, because all those questions he raised bubbled away for decades and decades. He had got me asking fundamental questions, which is why I took an interest in God and Jesus. But the only way I could make a journey through Christianity was by going back to what I learned age 5 and realize that the credibility of Jesus and the credibility of institutional religion are two totally different questions. And in the Scars of Eden, I try and separate those out once again for people to see that Jesus is one thing and what emerged in his name is something quite different. And there are all kinds of secrets and suppressions in the history of our institutions.
Yeah. So what would be the top 4, 5 points you would make that is without a doubt proving within the Christian scriptures an extraterrestrial influence on humanity from a long time ago?
Sure. Well, my logic was quite simple, really. Reread the Genesis stories, the stories of beginnings, the first 11 chapters, and you can do this with the whole of the Bible, but that's where I started, and use the root meanings of the words. So when you see the word Elohim, translate it as the powerful ones. Then read that alongside the Sumerian, Babylonian, Akkadian, and Assyrian stories, and it will be like taking the red pill. Because you will see straight away that Genesis is dependent on those. The stories of the powerful ones is the summary of those stories. So read those stories. Read them in the most broadly accepted translations, and you'll realize that those stories are not God's stories. They are stories about sky people who came and colonized our planet and governed over our ancestors, genetically modified us as a species so that we could be a kind of working class for the ET visitors. So as soon as you follow the logic thus far, you realize that the Elohim stories are stories about sky people. And some of the moral problems that you find in the Genesis stories and the Bible stories suddenly resolve. Suddenly you realize that we're not reading the story of the God who makes mistakes, who fails to anticipate things a child could anticipate, who changes his mind, who is incredibly violent and unforgiving. Thousands of people are slaughtered in the arguments he has against himself. It's a really incoherent picture. You've got a God who is against human progress time and again, who punishes human beings through the generations, even when they're trying to please him. The moment you do the translation, you realize what's actually happening is that humanity is caught in the crossfire of a conflict among the Elohim, among the powerful ones. So it's not just the parallels, it's the resolutions of all the stories in the biblical texts that will make you realize you've landed on something coherent, something that makes far more sense. The sky people are clearly extraterrestrial people. The moment you're willing to step out of that world and look at the correlations with other ancestral stories, they will always come from the stars, come from the skies. They will always come with advanced technology. They will always do genetic modification on our ancestors. And so a coherent picture forms. Get to Genesis 11, the story of the Tower of Babel, read that alongside the Sumerian, and it's very clear you're looking at technology that is to do with space travel. Get further into the Bible, do some more root meanings of words, and we start reading about technology in the Bible. Craft, the sound they make when they land, the effect on the ground when they land and launch, wormholes, again, we've got genetic modification, artificial insemination. We've got all manner, we've got communication devices, and they are all in the Bible, but they have not been translated as technology because between the writing of the original texts and the translations we read today, we've had generations of translators who had no technological grid. They didn't know what a wormhole looked like. They didn't know what a rocket launch looked like. They didn't know what interdimensional travel looked like. They didn't know what genetic modification was. And so they translate it in supernatural terms, which sometimes works. And then you get to other texts and you're reading stuff that is, I don't want to be disrespectful, but it's incoherent. And you know, just from reading the translation, something else is really going on there. But start from where I started, and you'll see very quickly what you're reading is our ancestors' encounters with technology. They described what they saw. And so now a 21st century mind can read the ancient texts, read the Hebrew texts, and recognize when a rocket launch is described, recognize when a wormhole is described, recognize when genetic modification is described, recognize when hybridization is being described, because we now have that technology. And so it's time, and this is part of what I say in the Scars of Eden, to go back to the ancient texts. They've been curated with such fidelity that we can still see and hear what the ancestors saw. Say, I have a pretty shrewd idea what's going on there. Let's retranslate that, and let's be plain about what they did see and hear.
So have we any scientific clues to us being genetically modified in any way? Is there anything with
Yes.
DNA, our chromosomes or anything?
Definitely, there's quite a lot actually. Chromosomes, definitely. DNA, definitely. Our neurology, definitely. So if I go to DNA first, when I was writing Escaping from Eden, one of the things that blew me away was to realize that you can find quite a body of scientists who are willing to put their hand up and say, we believe that intelligent conscious life on Earth came from outer space, that it didn't originate on the planet. In fact, if you go to Francis Crick, the co-discoverer of the double helix of DNA, his study of DNA brought him to that view, that genetic coding for intelligent life came from off-planet. In 2021, you go to the top scholars in DNA research, listen to Maxim Makukov, who I speak to in the book, and his colleague Vladimir Sherbak of the Fesenkov Astrophysical Institute and the Kazakh Al-Farabi National University, top authorities in DNA, they're saying the same thing. Genetic coding for life on Earth came from off-planet. Now, there are ancestral stories that express that same idea. The Zulu have the story of Unkulunkulu that gives a wonderfully cinematic version of that idea. But the reason these DNA scientists believe it is, first of all, Francis Crick believed it because the time frames for the development of what we have exceed the time frames of our planet. That was the start point of his logic. Carl Sagan believed it for that reason, and because he was reading ancient texts, the ones I talk about in the Scars of Eden. Maxim Makukov believes it because of mathematical patterns in our genetic code. And so I raised two eyebrows when I was reading this and thinking, wow, there are scientists who believe what the ancients said, the way I'm reading it. Serious money has been put into testing this theory. The European Space Agency has spent more than $80 billion testing this theory, which is called panspermia. And the theory of panspermia is that the genetic coding for intelligent, conscious, biological life has been seeded throughout the cosmos, or at least in this part of the cosmos. And that whenever it lands in an hospitable environment, meaning a planet with water, it will always generate forms of life similar to the ones we're familiar with. In other words, they're saying life in the universe is not the exception, it is the rule. Plato, 2,500 years ago, said the same thing on the basis of his own scientific research and his own philosophic reflections. So it's an ancient, ancient idea that does have correlations in contemporary science. And another place you can go to for some clues, which I found fascinating, is if you go into neuroscience and listen to the neuroscientists who study something called acquired savant syndrome. What they're studying is people who have an injury to the brain or a central nervous system event, and they come away from that injury with suddenly heightened cognitive abilities. And so you hear of people who will be in a car crash, they'll be in a coma, and when they wake up, they will be able to speak a language they couldn't speak before, or play a musical instrument they couldn't play before, or they'll have phenomenal mathematical skills, or constant whirrings of their mind in advanced physics, or they will look at things in the universe around them and they will see in their mind's eye the mathematical formulae that relate to every object they're looking at. Phenomenal advanced cognitive skills unlocked by an injury. Well, those neuroscientists, I think Darrell Trefford of Marion University has studied more than 70 of these cases. And what they're saying is that all of us have higher cognitive abilities in our brains that are in the off position. And by accident, they can be knocked on again. This absolutely baffles them because an injury to the brain should diminish your cognitive ability, it shouldn't extend. What on earth are advanced abilities doing our brains in the off position? They don't have an answer. They're willing to ask the questions. And of course, the $64,000 question, can we switch those bits on without having an accident? But our ancestors had an explanation. If you listen to the biblical story, the Mesopotamian story, Mesoamerican story, the Nigerian story, the ancient Greek story, they all have a story of human evolution that says that others came to primate ancestors on Earth and modified them, upgraded them to be a bit smarter, upgraded them a bit further, upgraded them again, and then found we were too smart to be managed. And so they had to dumb us down. And curiously, they all talk about us reaching a point where we are intrinsically cleverer, we have better precognitive skills, better remote viewing skills, better telepathic connection. And they then did something external to dumb us down. So in Genesis 11, we're bombed back and there's a neurological interference to bring us back to a pre-Stone Age condition where we can't speak to each other anymore. That's the Genesis version. And then in the Mesoamerican story, we're sprayed with a vapor to give us brain damage.
Really?
So,
wow.
Yeah, so that we no longer have those advanced skills. We're now limited to our 5 senses or have to trust what an authority tells us. They found they could manage us that way. In the Efik story, the Efik people of Nigeria, they talk about devices being released into the environment to damage our health, damage our mental health, to make us continually anxious and agitated, and then we could be managed. And so they all have this story saying, yeah, we all had these skills before, and then something was done to us to switch them off. Those ancestral stories correlate with what our neuroscientists are saying about the brain, that our brains should be capable of far more, but something has happened to switch these capacities off. The way those stories line up, I find absolutely fascinating. And coming back to what you were saying before, Josh, about the attractiveness of mystical traditions, it's always been the role of our mystics and our shamanic traditions to find ways of elevating our consciousness, switching these cognitive skills back on, get our remote viewing working again, get us tuned in more to our telepathic connection, get us better able to engage our precognition. So these things all relate. The knowledge that our mystics and shamanic people have curated, the knowledge that's been curated by our ancestral narratives, and the discoveries being made today by our scientists. It's the correlations that really caught my attention and that made me realize I had to put this information out there in escaping from Eden.
So what I'm seeing, I didn't know what you just mentioned, that they sprayed and they also put stuff in the environment to enter into people's bodies to shut them down and all that stuff. For me, I'm hearing chemtrails and nanotech. Like, I mean,
Well,
is history repeating itself right now, or what?
I think it raises the question of what's the purpose of the ancient stories? Is it to tell us what happened before, or is it that plus they're warning us?
Yeah.
They're giving us a heads up as to what to look out for.
Yeah. If I was an ET race and I wanted these helpful workers, I definitely would be concerned about making them too smart, because if they become too smart, they will rebel. And also, I would make sure that there will be genes switched on that will make them more like worshiping. They want to worship and subdue, and
Yes.
and will be very good at having authority to tell them what to do. And so, because when I'm looking at the world right now, I am in awe about how much the powers that be can get away with on the planet right now, without without much I mean, there's resistance, but not considering what's going on. It's staggering to watch for me. And so so I can say two things about that. One is I really do think humanity is waking up. I think the medication doesn't work that we are being given. We are waking up either way. But I think also the battle is really hard for us because we're genetically programmed to follow authority. So it's really deep in our DNA, in our instincts to do so. And so I think this is why we have let this go so far in the world as it is right now.
I think you're right. We are shamefully docile.
Yeah.
And I agree with you, Joshua. I think from the beginning, we were wired to be docile. If you read the Popol Vuh, which is the Mayan story of beginnings, it says the whole purpose of our ET colonizers in engineering us from our primate ancestors was to create a workforce, to create an intelligent but docile presence on the planet. And you can see through history, we are really wired for that. We are so easily managed. Mm-hmm. We are so easily conquered. We're so easily manipulated. You go back to the stories of the dragons, where you've got some ugly non-human entity, and it's able to govern over the people because the people defer to them. Yeah. And it takes them a long time to realize if we organize, if we act together, we can govern ourselves. Yeah. It takes a long time to reach that point. And you can see it in national histories as well. I think that docility is something I see being countered. When I was talking about reframing the teachings of Jesus, going back and reading them afresh, you go back to Jesus and you've got a people there who've been conquered, they're under Roman domination, and they are all wanting to see different rulers. And there is a pressure to make Jesus a king because he seems a bit nicer than the kings they've got. Yeah. But what Jesus says is, you have no superiors. Mm. You are all brothers and sisters. Call no one on earth your leader or your teacher or your father. You are all siblings. And he says in the gospel, these tiers of authority and obedience and rank and importance, that's no way to live. You are all peers. Now, that's the teachings of Jesus. And you can see he's trying to unravel this idea, the whole idea of serving superiors or even of serving God. Jesus completely reframes that to mean we serve one another. We love one another. Mm-hmm. That wonderful sermon of the Apostle Paul's I was talking about before, where he's talking to this audience in Athens, after saying we're all intimately connected with each other and with the source, he absolutely mocks the idea of sacrificial religion, the idea that we have to serve a superior Because he says, if God is the source, if that's what we're talking about, how can the source need us to supply it? It's the other way around. It's either the source or it isn't. And so both of them are doing things that totally unravel this idea of civility and subjection. And at different times in history, the powers have realized there is that revolutionary strand within the teachings of those guys, so that when you go to the history of slavery in the United States of America, or I should say, it wasn't the United States at that time, slavery, when was the Union? I need to refresh myself on that history, but I do know that when slaves were held legally in the United States of America, what is now, the slave masters had grave concerns about teaching them Christianity, because there is a storyline in the Bible that says you should have no masters, you should have no leaders. Even in the current edit of the Hebrew stories, right at the core of that story is of a bunch of slaves who get out from under their Egyptian masters. So there's all this revolutionary stuff in there. The history of empire, the history of institutions, is one of reinstating and refeudalizing society. And I think one of the takeaways for me from the research I've done in the story of our origins is that we are far more interesting, creative, powerful beings than that. And we are wasting our time if we think we're here on this planet to serve superiors.
Yeah.
Plato said we're here to learn consciousness, intelligence, love, and harmony. And that sounds a lot more like looking after each other than all slaving for people more powerful and more wealthy than ourselves.
Absolutely. And so what I'm hearing you say is the institutions and the genetic manipulations on a biological level wants to put us inside this where we follow authority.
Yes.
But there is something in us that is going completely opposite of that, which is also the words of the Christ, the true Christ. And so that's the spirit in us. So it feels to me like there's the external institutions and all the manipulations, all the control that is going on. And then there's also even your own biology that has been designed to be like that, to take this in and allow this to happen. And your mind has been programmed through many generations. And yet there is another voice coming in that is much stronger, that is overriding all this and saying, no, go opposite direction. And so humanity is breaking free, and I think it's entirely a spiritual revolution. It has nothing to do with anything else. It's purely in consciousness and spirit, where we are waking up from this programming, this control system that's been in play for hundreds of thousands of years?
Yes, I think so.
Yeah.
I think you can talk about time frames like that because there's pretty compelling evidence of prehistoric mining in Southern Africa that is at least 200,000 years old. So who was mining those mines? Well, evidently, our ancestors were on the planet at that time, people who were our size and shape, our design, apparently not as smart as we are, not clever enough to farm or to build cities, but clever enough to work in someone else's mine.
Yeah.
And I think the evidence for that is pretty strong. And so you've got some evidence there that relates to a sequence of interventions in our evolution. So I think something had happened to get us to the point where we could mine, because you can't mine with chimpanzees, you can't mine with gorillas.
Yeah.
And yet the story of our civilization that begins with the discovery of how to farm, that only goes back about 10,000 years. I say 10,000 years, you go back to the top of the Fertile Crescent, to Dag, where scientists from the University of Az in Norway and the Max Planck Institute believe they've identified where farming began. a very precise location where they say one tribe or maybe even one family worked out how to genetically modify 11 naturally occurring plants so they could be cultivated as crops. And at the same time, they discovered how to do animal husbandry. They learned it there, and then all of a sudden it peppers up around the world. So it looks like the beginning of the story of civilization, except you travel a few hundred kilometers down the road and you'll find a megalithic site from that same time that is clearly the vestiges of a culture we know nothing about.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's a case study in the loss of a previous civilization and the commencing of a new one. So as soon as you see that, then put that alongside the minds that are 200,000 years old question, and you have to ask, how many civilizations have lived on this planet?
Yeah.
How many resets have we had? Because in those first chapters of Genesis, there are at least 3 resets of civilization referenced on the planet. Plato said every few thousand years, something happens that takes civilization on Earth back to a virtual zero and it has to start again. And he believed that was planetary cataclysms that caused that. And so we've got a very, very long story and maybe layers and layers of memory of beginnings and re-beginnings embedded in our ancestral stories.
And there's a lot of indigenous stories, mythologies, and that they are, narrating through generations that goes way back in time, way back. And also, I read this book, Forbidden Archaeology, many years ago about artifacts, out of place artifacts that we don't want to talk about because then you lose your job if you do stuff like that.
Yes.
And some of the dating of that is staggering. It's millions of years, some of them. So and then also what I recall is the Sumerian kings list. They have been around. So the Sumerian, these Anunnaki, has been around for a long time. And so I think we have had a lot of stuff going on this planet for a lot longer than we think, and it's just buried. It's just deep in the ground, and we don't, accidentally we will dig out a piece of coal with a hammerhead in it or something like that. But mostly it's gone. I think we've been around for a long time.
I agree. And I think we, as you rightly say, we come across physical artifacts or artifacts in our ancestral narratives that do not fit within the timelines that we know about. You can go to some of the ancestral narratives, for instance, and hear about, you can go to Greek and Roman historians, poets, novelists, and they will talk about the time when the moon arrived, when the Earth captured the moon. Well, what's the timeline for that? There was apparently there was a human population on the planet when it happened, and the people are referred to as the Proselenes by one ancient Greek writer. So you've got that. You've got various stories. You can go to Central and South America. You can go to India. You can go to the Greek stories. I think it's there in the Mesopotamian stories as well. Something happening in our solar system that rearranges how the planets are moving, that again cause cataclysms on the planet. Well, how long ago is that? And then you go to Genesis 9, 10, and 11, and you've got verses, again, root meanings of the words, please. If you read it that way, you've got a story about the separation of the continents. It says in the beginning, the land on the earth had one coastline. It was all joined up. And then it says in the generation of Peleg, that's when the lands separated. Well, the separation of the continents fits nowhere in our timeline for Homo sapiens. So what civilization remembered that?
Yeah.
There's ancestral story in Australia that refers to the separation of Australia from India. So that's tens of thousands of years, but is it actually a story from millions of years ago? Is it a story bequeathed to us from a totally other civilization that lived here that we know nothing about. If we start looking for evidences of really ancient cultures, how are we going to find it? If there was a civilization here before Homo sapiens, before the age of the mammals, before the age of the dinosaurs, before the Cambrian explosion, we would know nothing about it because it would be compressed within millimeters of sediment.
Yeah.
Unless we're part of a wider cosmic story and a wider cosmic family who bring their stories with us. And when into the Sumerian kings list, that's really what you're looking at. You're looking at a timeline that goes way beyond anything we can track if we're looking at the story of Homo sapiens.
Mm.
And you only have to sit with these incongruities for a while to realize the story of life on Earth is far older than we've ever imagined.
Yeah, way older. You said, what did you say just a few minutes ago? You said, unless we are part of a wider
cosmic family.
Cosmic family. See, that is a big topic right there, because I mean, I'm personally convinced we have humans on other, like human-like beings all over this galaxy.
Yes.
There's a lot of science that are pointing towards it, because the way the center of the galaxy is sending out the energies is actually rearranging DNA into a specific form. And the Gnostics are teaching about the aeons at the center of the galaxy is having the apanoia, the imagination, and they actually created humans through their imagination. And
yes,
and so this is the radiation from the center of the galaxy coming out. So maybe there is some base foundational creational forces that create 2 arms, 2 legs, and eyes, and all that stuff. So maybe we have been around a long time, and we've been off planet and on planet, and I mean, we don't know.
The theory of panspermia would lead us to expect to meet forms of life that are somewhat similar to ourselves. And if you talk to evolutionary scientists, they will talk about batches of codes belonging to each other.
Mm-hmm.
And so when they explain the evolution of something like the whale, they will say, well, there are codes for an aquatic eye, aquatic skin, aquatic cardiovascular system, functional fish-shaped tail. Those codes belong together. There's a coherence to them. And so you might expect to see something that looks like a whale on another planet, or that looks like a human on another planet. And this is part of what I drew from my conversation with Maxim Makukov.
Uh-huh.
And so, you go back to all the science fiction you watched as a kid, and I used to imagine when I watched Star Trek that the reason most of the aliens turned up with 2 arms, 2 legs, a head and a neck and a torso was really the limits of the budget of Desilu Productions. It turns out, no, there is good science to suppose that may well happen. And then when you listen to our ancestors, they say, well, that's what did happen. That people arrived in our deep past who did look rather like us, who helped us and who nurtured us in the deep past. If you go to some of the world's abduction narratives, which are thousands of years old, they invariably say that those who are involved in hybridizing with human beings look almost indistinguishable from human beings, other than they're very beautiful, their skin color is a little bit different. In the Philippines, we're told they don't have a philtrum on the top lip. But whether you're listening to the Welsh version, the Greek version, the African version, wherever you listen, those notes are there, that there is another presence here that looks very similar to human, but isn't. And that's an interesting repeat. Yeah,
very. And of course, it's not like all beings out there are human-like. I think there's reptilians and there's many other beings.
And very energy-based life forms, plasma, which are mentioned by many traditions.
Yeah, absolutely. So there is in the Rig Vedas from India, They describe that we have 432,000 motor neurons going down from our brain into our body. And each motor neuron is a representation of a humanoid civilization in the galaxy. And so we have 432,000 humanoid civilization in the galaxy. And the Rig Veda goes in to say that I think it was 2/3 of them are conscious and know why they're there. They know God. And 1/3 is unconscious and they don't know God. And so, and we belong to that part. we belong to the unconscious civilization.
Yeah.
Hopefully that is changing. However, our human physiology in its sacred geometric divine creation with the motor neurons, we are connected to the galactic brotherhood through this nervous system. And so in our body, we have the coding of the galactic brotherhood, and we are all connected.
Yes, I think that's wonderful. I love how that is expressed, because if you go to a different source, if you listen to contemporary DNA scientists, listen to Maxim Makukov, Vladimir Sherbak, they will often talk about all this junk DNA, junk coding within our DNA. But there are scientists saying, no, that's not junk coding. That's the coding of other life forms in other parts of the cosmos. And so again, you've got a correlation in contemporary science.
Serious scientists are saying this?
Serious scientists are saying this. Remember,
wow,
they believe in panspermia.
Yeah,
they believe this coding has gone everywhere. And so if we've got stuff in our DNA that doesn't relate to making a human being, then it relates to making something we don't know about. And so you've got serious credentialed scientists putting forward that view.
Wow.
And then you've got the ancient writers of the Rig Vedas saying exactly the same.
Yeah.
And I'll just add that idea of levels of consciousness, that there are beings like us who have this this higher consciousness, this connection with source, this connection with one another. And then you've got others who are sort of asleep. They're like drones. It's very possible that right across that spectrum, you've got species with advanced technology.
Yeah.
And if you listen to the accounts of encounters, and if you're willing to take them seriously, it would seem to me that we are encountering almost that full spectrum. Mm-hmm. That some people have encounters with entities that just seem to have no spark of compassion, love, imagination. They are almost like robots the way they behave. And then there are others who seem to be almost spiritual, to use that language, in the way they connect with us, who connect empathically, telepathically, who nurture us. And this brings me to saying that just because visitors have technology that's better than us doesn't make them better than us.
No.
And the interest that's shown in planet Earth suggests to me something.
Oh, dropping out. You're dropping out. I don't know if you can hear me, but you froze now, and I cannot even hear the audio right now. Okay, I'm gonna press pause on the recording here, and then get back when I get this on. Okay, we're back. Okay, so I feel we were kind of going deep into this with the galactic humanity, that we are our family is way bigger than just the planet. And I think there's I think it's important, because when you say all this junk DNA, and when I talk about the 432,000 motor neurons and all stuff, to me, it tells me that if just one part of humanity makes it to a certain level, the rest will be equipped with the possibility of going the same way as much. What I'm hearing many times when the more esoteric conversations are coming out about ETs and the spiritual, and why they are so interested in us, actually has to do with, we actually have total spiritual capacity of complete God realization, which is something not all species can. And I think we have this capacity. I think because of this brotherhood we have out there, and that many of them, or these civilizations, has gone so far, and that's why the human body has been equipped with these specific centers, and the way the energy moves, and the capacity of the DNA to really, and the brain, we're using the whole brain, and we're tapping. And you talk about how people have accidents and suddenly they can do things that are completely like a miracle. So there's all the potential in us. And so, and that brings me to, because I know you have had some experiences with the Christ energy, and I've had my own mystical experiences. And once this energy shows itself, merges itself in you, I feel it's such a massive energy. It's so much love that is almost unbearable to hold. But I know the human body is capable of it. It's designed to, but we're still, learning to move more and more towards this light. And so I want people to understand we have a tremendous spiritual capacity. And so
yes.
with that, I would love to talk to you more about this Jesus and the Christ. And could you talk more about what is that? What does that mean to us as human beings in this moment?
Certainly. Well, if I go back to Plato, I'm going to go there because when you get to Jesus, when you get to the beginning of the gospel, if you read the beginning of the Gospel of John, there's this beautiful prologue that says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. And then the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. It's talking about Jesus. We beheld his glory, one full of grace and truth. You get further into the gospel, and Jesus lives his life, he gives his teachings, and then towards the end of his life, he's praying to the source, whom he describes as Father, and he says, Father, now I'm returning to you, back to the glory we enjoyed before the foundation of the world. That journey, that hero's journey that's described, that in the beginning, the Word is God, is an aspect of God, and then incarnates and lives this life, and then returns, enriched by the journey. Plato said that's the story of all of us. That's exactly how Plato described the experience of this life. He believed that originally there was consciousness. Then consciousness fractalized to form the material universe. You and I are part of that story. So our consciousness comes from source consciousness. Of course it does. Mm-hmm. Just as our energy comes from source energy.
Yeah.
So we are here as conscious beings from the original consciousness. In this life, we then are wrestling with a great cosmic question. Because if everything began with a unified field of consciousness, intelligence, then clearly this material experience is asking the question, can we do consciousness this way? Can we do consciousness, intelligence, love, and harmony as a universe of seemingly separate entities, all exercising free choice? That's the question of this material experience. It's the question we wrestle with as individuals. By the end of my life, have I learned to love?
Yeah.
Have I woken up? Am I conscious? Have I lived intelligently? And Plato said that's really the purpose of our lives. And then we return, hopefully, with the learning that we've gathered through the journey. So we're here with the purpose of being conscious. Now, I've said there's like a nuts and bolts version of that whole story, which is panspermia. It means that the purpose of our material bodies is to host consciousness and intelligence. Now, we are a particular blend on planet Earth. It's a particular size planet with particular makeup of beings. We have animal strength, we have mammal emotion, we have higher consciousness, and the cocktail that we are, I believe, gives humans a very special ability in emotion and compassion and love and consciousness. All those ancestral stories say that when our visitors came and tried to re-engineer us from a primate ancestor, what they got was far more intelligent and conscious than they thought they were going to get. Mm-hmm. It's an interesting little note there.
Yeah.
So I think some of our visitors come and say, in the great cosmic question, can we do consciousness, intelligence, harmony? The human beings have a very special contribution here because there is a potential within them for love, compassion, creativity, awakeness, alertness that is superb. And that may be one of the reasons why some of our visitors want to hybridize with us to get what some of we have in their gene pool. You see, we are contributing to that great question of consciousness. And I do believe that because of our animal heritage, our mammal heritage, we have something unique. And I think it relates to compassion, it relates to creativity. And the moment you see us in that perspective, and you begin to understand the abduction narratives of our world cultures in that perspective, I think it makes you appreciate who we are in quite a different way. And you begin to understand why there might be this story about God consciousness or source consciousness. Again, you go back to Jesus with all that reframing, and you realize he is modeling for us what it means to have a conscious connection with source. Jesus's very first sermon is
It's dropping out again. It's dropping out. It's dropping out. I don't know if you can hear me, but I cannot hear you. I think Australia is waking up right now. Too bad. It's so interesting. Okay, I'm gonna pause recording. Okay. We are on.
Once again, if you go to the root meanings of the words in that first sermon of Jesus, what he's saying is, be transformed, because you can be transformed, because the amazing power of the source is available to all of us. That's what the words mean when you translate them and when you peel off all the layers of church doctrines and associations that have been layered over the top. So he's talking about human beings having amazing access to source power and the principles of the source, which seems to be coming at the same notion of our ability in consciousness and higher intelligence and things that might flow from that. Jesus then, of course, goes around and demonstrates what a connection with the source might look like. He certainly lives differently to others. He lives fearlessly. He manifests healings. He can do entity removal, things that tell you there's something else going on with this guy that means we should be paying attention. Now go back to the sermon, and it sounds like this: repent, for the kingdom of heaven.
You're dropping out again. Oh man,
what a shame.
Yeah, now you're back. Now you're back. But the most important part just drops out. It's just like frustrating.
Oh dear.
Okay, try again.
How?
What did he
Okay.
say? Repent. What did he say? Repent.
Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is near. And because of centuries of church teachings, that sounds almost like a warning. And it's because the church has put forward these ideas of a fear of hell, eternal conscious torment, all that. And so you hear those words and you think, oh, Jesus is warning people, God's going to turn up, they'd better sort their lives out or he's going to punish. But all that framing isn't in the sermon. It's come from centuries of institutional Christianity. And that angry God image is all built on the false translations that we talked about at the beginning, where we're reading stories of dragons and thinking we're reading about God. So this is why I think translation is so fundamental. Get these words right, and we're into the territory that you and I were just talking about, of humanity's amazing capacity for consciousness.
Oh, you dropped out. You, just at the last part, something with consciousness, the last. But okay, should we stop here and then call it a day? I mean, we've been going on for 1 hour and 15 minutes because I have a feeling this internet thing is not going to go away. And,
yes, okay.
And so maybe one day we can do a part 2 of this.
We'll do a part 2.
Okay.
We'll do a part 2.
Okay. So we will set up a part 2, and so we will stop here now. Maybe we should meet so early that Australia isn't woken up yet at that time when we talk.
Yeah, I'm happy to go earlier, see if that gives us a better connection.
Yes. Just one quick one. Repent yourself. I was told by a spiritual teacher called Adyashanti. He says repent actually means to turn around, meaning to look within. Is this true? Oh, now you're dropping out.
The Greek.
Okay, now you're here. I can
the
hear
Greek word. The Greek word for repent is metanoia, which means it means go beyond your mind. That's what it really means.
That's a deep spiritual word.
Go beyond your mind, or transcend your mind.
That's deeply spiritual. Has nothing to do with repent, meaning feel guilty and say I'm sorry all the time. I mean, so
no, it doesn't.
So there's deep spiritual wisdom, but it's just been, washed out.
It's been distorted. It's been deliberately distorted. Paul as well unpacks that in Romans when he says, "Be transformed by the transformation of your mind." So he's got the same idea. But because of all this hellfire framing, it distorts all that into straighten your life out or God's going to punish you.
Yeah. Okay. So
not the same at all.
Not at all. And now suddenly I can actually be with Christianity. Now I can actually take it serious, because now it's about the real true spirit within, and you're finding out who you truly are inside, instead of this angry God that is punishing you and has jealousy and murderous intent and stuff like that.
Exactly. and not only that, you're supposed to love him. And worship him.
Yes.
And that does something horrible if you think about it. It is humiliating to us to worship an entity that will torment us forever if we do the wrong thing.
He will put you in hell if you don't behave, but he loves you. Yeah,
and you must love him. It's not coherent. It's absolutely horrible. It's horrible that people accept it, but a lot of people accept it knowing there's something off, which is why I get a lot of readers discovering Escaping from Eden and the Scars of Eden, and suddenly it's like the scales have fallen from their eyes, and they'll say, I always knew something was wrong.
Yeah. And the beautiful thing I feel with your message is it does not mean you cannot love Christ. It does not mean that you cannot be a lover of of the message
Definitely.
that Jesus came out with. So, you know, I feel
Exactly.
that is so beautiful because, you know, I know millions of people have the mystical experiences with the light, with the Christ, and so
That's right.
they are in conflict. They're like, but it's so real. So
Exactly.
why am I still having these conflicts? Because it's so real. I know people who can go into a church and they're just tears are flowing and the heart is bursting open, and I mean, they have this divine experience, mystical experience, and so it must be true with Christianity, everything the Bible says. And so,
Yes, that's right. That's the false equation, isn't it?
yeah.
But it's very interesting when you ask people, people will often then use different language to describe what they've experienced, and they'll say, well, I encountered the risen Jesus, and that convinced me that what my church taught is true. If you then say, tell me what you experienced, they'll say, I experienced unconditional love.
Mm-hmm.
I experienced this incredible light.
Yeah.
I experienced complete ease. All right, that's what you experienced.
Yeah.
And so you go to the stories of revivals, and
Oh, you're dropping out. Okay. I think this conversation is so important. I really just want to continue this conversation on around the Christ in a part 2. So let's hold for now. I don't even know if Paul is going to come back, but there will be a part 2. I promise. I will catch Paul and we will continue this conversation. And for me, I've been enjoying this very much. This has been exciting for me to talk about because I'm deeply passionate about all this. And Paul is an amazing guy to talk to about all this. So part 2 will come, and I'll see you there.